I'd like to look at, again, with the Cambridge Companion to Utilitarianism. I'm now in Chapter 7, and in this video I'm going to have a little look at rule utilitarianism. Now, rule utilitarianism is, as the name suggests, it's a form of utilitarianism now that looks at rules as its fundamental. Remember, act utilitarianism looked at acts of the agent as fundamental and asked, well, what consequences come from the acts? Now, this is a little more abstract, and it looks at the consequences of rules, following rules, what you get when that happens. And rule utilitarianism, not surprisingly, is a family of theories. So one of the most common ones, the common form of rule utilitarianism, is sometimes called the collective ideal code rule utilitarianism. And what does that mean? It basically talks about adopting a moral code. Now, it's a bit ambiguous as to what it means to adopt a moral code, because you could think of a moral code in the way that you could think of a mathematical set of axioms, a set of axioms in mathematics like geometry, where you just, you have your axioms, and you just use a form of some aspects of logic on those axioms, and transformation rules and deduction rules, and you grind out theorems. Is that what it means to internalize or adopt a moral code? That doesn't seem right. This doesn't seem how we do it. It's not simply to memorize. Internalize the code doesn't mean just memorize, but live the code. Sometimes we use the term cultured. So to become really cultured in the code is to live it, where it becomes a part of you, and you act according to it. But consider, though, that internalizing and living a code and becoming cultured, not everyone will live the code identically. So different people, they're cultured in the same culture, but they may not come to the exact same manners of living. All right, so what can we say about this? Well, again, this chapter, there's a lot going on in here, and I just want to make a fundamental contrast with act utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism, as I mentioned earlier in a previous video, can seem a little simple. For example, let's say you promise X, somebody, $5 if X mows your lawn. So yeah, I'll hire you to mow my lawn. And then all of a sudden, you find out that another person, Y, actually needs the money more. And you think, oh, well, if I get maybe 10 units of goodness by paying X to mow my lawn, but you know what? I get 15 or 20 units of goodness come out if I pay Y. And in that sense, simple arithmetic says that you get more units of goodness out of doing one thing than the other. So in which action should you take? Well, act utilitarianism very simply says you should go for the act that maximizes your choice set, right? And your choice set is to pay X or Y. So you pay Y, you give Y the job. Now, again, there was a nice sort of cleanliness to act utilitarianism, because they didn't talk about all these other extraneous things that go into the decision. No, it doesn't even talk about all this, the elements and the characteristics that are involved in the situation of the choice set, right? Paying or X versus paying Y. It simply looks at the outcomes and the amount of good. If it's 10 units of goodness for giving X, and 15 for Y, you go for Y. But of course, the real utilitarian could say, wait a second, there's a different way to look at this. You should really keep your promises. Now, keeping your promise in this instance would be to still pay X, and you result with 10 units of goodness. And breaking your promise would give you 15 units when you pay Y. However, the rule utilitarian says, look, remember, with utilitarianism, we're not just, and this is the problem of boundaries that I mentioned earlier, we're not just looking at the choice set in terms of the choices here and now. Well, we're looking at choices here and now, but not simply results here and now. Think about long-term results. What if, imagine if you say, well, I'm not going to have that rule of obeying promises. well, what's the consequences of breaking that versus holding it? So the consequences of keeping this rule, right? That's what we should be looking at, the consequences of holding and breaking rules rather than individual actions. So overall, yeah, it might be the case that in the short term, I have less or fewer goods by keeping my promise, but in the long run, I'm going to create more good in the world by keeping my promise. So in that sense, if we want to maximize good in the world, we should be looking at rules of our behavior, not individual acts of our behavior. So it's an abstraction from acts to rules governing acts. So think about it in this context, and you can see why a lot of the early utilitarians, they were often concerned with social reform. And so while they Mill and Bentham, they slide back and forth between act and utilitarianism, but they were often concerned with, well, how should we bring in rules? What's the consequences of rules? And so a lot of their writings dealt with looking at the results of rules. Like, is it better to bring in a rule to do something than to do something else or not have that rule or whatnot? But the fundamental aspect of, or the, shall we say, the fundamental category was rules, not necessarily acts. Now, you might think, oh, well, then let's all be rule utilitarians. So, maybe that's the way to go. If we want to maximize things, let's have good rules, and then everything should be fine. Well, yeah, it kind of looks like that way at the beginning, but so that's one of the pros, is that you keeping your promises is better than breaking. But right, we sometimes get into situations where we think, yeah, maybe you should break a promise. So how seriously then, right, can the theory tell me when I should break a promise? And in rule utilitarianism, if you set up a fundamental, it's not going to always tell you when you should break your promise. So how seriously should you take it? And also, if you take it really seriously, like, oh yeah, I always keep my promises, aren't you sliding into another theory, namely a deontological theory, and a perfect duty? Like, is promise keeping, is that an example of a Kantian perfect duty, which admits of no exceptions? And in that sense, does rule utilitarianism push you into deontology, or do you sometimes fall prey to what some people say it's a kind of rule worship, right? In that sense, that you get locked into this and you can't get out. Also, is rule utilitarianism really a betrayal of a fundamental utilitarian notion of agent neutrality, where the agent is not supposed to matter, right? It was a way to get around intentions and all these things and say what really matters are the products of your actions, or the observable consequences. And so we're not going to look at the quality of the agent. So we don't want to be looking at abstractions and like promises and promise keeping and all that stuff. But you're dragging all that back in now, when utilitarianism was an attempt to get rid of all that stuff and just look at practical consequences, and that we can get on with social reforms. But now you're bringing all that stuff back in, and so agents, it's going to matter. So does it matter more, if this is my son that I promised, or my friend, or a stranger? That's just getting all back into and violating the whole notion of agent neutrality. So maybe it's not really even a straightforward utilitarian kind of theory. All right, so that's just the basics, and you can, if this interests you, you can go and check out this chapter in much more detail, because it contextualizes it and also offers more of a discussion of this idea that rule utilitarianism, remember, is a family of theories. So once again, this is an example that I've been, of what I've been saying about utilitarianism, that it just ramifies. So when you think you've got a particular species, you've actually got, once again, a genus, and there's, a set of possibilities that you could have. This is just one. So that's it for rule utilitarianism. See you next video.